This week on Act Out, our addiction to militarism has to end. From million-strong protest in Yemen to carte blanche for military force at the border, our violent empire has no dimmer switch and no self-restraint. Next up, the impossible always seems so until you invoke Planck's constant? This and other news of impossible change. Finally, Margaret Flowers from Popular Resistance and Trade for People and Planet sits down with us to discuss the USMCA, what you might know as NAFTA. From tweets to marching in the streets, this is Act Out.
Rockets! Blockade! Bulldozers swarm outside the checkpoint gate. A noise flash broke the hush and blew me into the street. I awoke next to the body of my baby.
Welcome to Act Out. I'm Eleanor Goldfield, and this is your tipping point. Alternative media outlets and humanitarian orgs have dubbed the genocide in Yemen the Forgotten War, and with good reason. Our media is about as adverse to the topic as you are to spending Thanksgiving with your racist uncle, who, I hope, you challenge on this most recent edition of a white supremacist holiday steeped in a grotesque lie that only seeks to whitewash genocide and perpetuate indigenous oppression. I'm really fun at parties. Anyway, the ongoing genocide in Yemen, bolstered by our military, may be forgotten by, or indeed unknown to, many Americans. But for Yemenis, not only is the crisis painfully present, but so is the U.S. role in that crisis. An estimated 85,000 children under the age of 5 have already died of hunger and/or disease since the outbreak of the war in 2015. And even before the war, certainly during, U.S. drone strikes in Yemen have been going on for the better part of 16 years. And a recent study shows that this year alone, at least 1 in 3 killed by U.S. drone strikes were civilians. Still, to paint Yemen as a passive victim of Saudi American aggression would be a mistake. On Sunday, November 18th, millions of Yemenis marched and protested across 6 Yemeni provinces to commemorate the birthday of Islam's Prophet Muhammad and to denounce Saudi Arabia and its coalition allies' military campaign against the country. Leader of the Houthi movement, the organizers of this march, Abdul Malik Badreddin al-Houthi, said in his speech, quote, "The Yemeni people deserve the right to self-defense, freedom, and independence in the face of Saudi-led aggression." The Saudi war on Yemen, backed by the United States, shows Washington's support for terrorists. Protesters carried Yemeni flags and photos of victims while they chanted anti-Saudi slogans and listened to speeches like al-Houthi's that not only denounced U.S. involvement in this war, but also made the connections to the Palestinian fight for freedom by calling out Saudi and UAE efforts to build relations with the apartheid state. Yemenis are far from ignorant of the drivers of their plight, and they are far from passive victims. This powerful show of resolve, combined with continued international pressure to stop the genocide in Yemen, is critical, and demands our attention and support. The censored silence of our media is nothing short of criminal. As Americans, as children of the empire, we have a role in this war, and it's up to us to decide whether that role is passive bystander or active dissident. And speaking of wars and roles, you will recall from last week our coverage of the Migrant Caravan and the necessary shifting of paradigms as we respond to this tactic. You may also have heard this past weekend about the tear gas deployed in Tijuana at children. And last week, you may also have heard news that the border troops are only authorized to stay at the border till mid-December, underscoring the notion that Trump only sent troops to the border to make a pre-midterm point, a nice little nationalist showcase for the folks headed to the ballot box. And that could be good news, I guess, on the surface. But the question as to how many of the roughly 5,900 active duty troops and the 2,100 National Guard forces are actually leaving, staying, or being replaced is unclear. Meanwhile, the Pentagon told Congress last Tuesday that the estimated cost of the troop deployment thus far is roughly $210 million. Costs which would of course rise if the deployment is extended. According to military officials, an extension, quote, seemed likely, but hadn't been agreed upon yet. And I sure am glad that that money is going to tear gassing children and to man a line in the sand rather than, say, hurricane survivors or various other climate refugees, education, healthcare, or, hey, even a free stress ball for every American so that they can be momentarily soothed from the anxiety of our country's dumb shittedness. But that is just a silly request for free money. Further raising an eyebrow to reports of troop removal is the fact that on Tuesday, November 20th, a day after the reports of troop removal came out, the White House signed a memo allowing troops at the border to engage in domestic law enforcement duties to protect border agents, including, quote, a show or use of force, including lethal force, crowd control, i.e. that tear gas, temporary detention, and cursory search. Again, this memo came after the reports that troops were headed home in mid-December. So the human rights issues with a memo like this are pretty damn clear at face value. But even with regards to our own laws, this memo contradicts the 1878 Posse Comitatus Act in two ways. A, when the armed forces perform tasks assigned to an organ of civil government, and or B, when the armed forces perform tasks assigned to them solely for purposes of civilian government. The law does allow the president to use military force in crushing an insurrection, something that we covered back in episode 183. But basically, this last memo authorizing the use of lethal force by our own military within our own borders is strikingly new, and also illegal. Now, I'm not really one to give a shit whether something is legal when considering the ethical context. After all, slavery was legal. But the fact that this memo doesn't just fly in the face of basic human rights, but also in the face of legislation passed back in post-war white supremacist golden age is worth noting. Still, defense officials claim that the act is unlikely to really be invoked, since it's seen as more of a quote, background principle than anything to really actually utilize. Furthermore, as the act was originally passed in order to protect states from being taken over by federal troops, it doesn't really apply. Yeah, I'd say it has less to do with that, and more to do with the fact that our government loves some bloodshed, and they're really, on either side of the aisle, unlikely to stand up to the president on anything dealing with our exceptional military. Which is why this is so damn scary. Our crazed lust for blood and power has our military stretched over 900 military bases in 70% of the world's countries. Did we really think that this wouldn't hit home? That this absolute disdain for human rights, justice, and autonomy wasn't already at play here? That steps like these merely make a creeping militarism, a rising fascism, that much more overt? Yet again, we see why we have to connect our struggles. Why it's so vital to not look on and think, well, shit, I'm glad I'm not them. To think that military force unleashed domestically will somehow be quarantined by existing laws or mild temperaments is dangerously naive. Be it Yemen or the border escalation, our addiction to militarism has to end. Now I know what you're thinking. Shit, Eleanor, stopping the military-industrial complex? That's impossible. That's like getting tens of countries together to agree on something that affects our daily lives as human beings. Well, it's funny that you should say that, because earlier this month, representatives from 60 nations met in Versailles, France, to approve a new definition for the kilogram. You might not know that because we don't use that system, but this new system, based on Planck's constant, the new measurement will be more stable than the previous physical object, a platinum iridium cylinder stored in a locked vault in the bowels of the International Bureau of Weights and Measurements in Sèvres, France. So the point of this, we can actually get together and change our minds about things. We can say that, hey, the calculations here show that this is wrong, therefore here's a solution. And the same could be said for war, or just science in general. And here we could take a page from Spain's Book of Solutions. Earlier this month, Spain announced a plan to switch its entire electricity system over to renewables by 2050. In order to reach this goal, Spain has several outlined action items. First off, they plan on installing at least 3,000 megawatts of wind and solar capacity every year in the next 10 years. Secondly, and hold on to something because the sound of this sentence is just so much common sense at once, it might hurt. New licenses for fossil fuel drills, hydrocarbon exploitation, and fracking wells will be banned, and a fifth of the state budget will be reserved for measures that can mitigate climate change. Wow. As if to say, hey, we know where pollution comes from. We're going to stop that. And make sure that the hell that they've already wrought does not go ignored. And that's not all. Under the plan, just transition contracts will be drawn up, similar to the £220 million package announced in October, that will shut most Spanish coal mines in return for a suite of early retirement schemes. Reskilling in clean energy jobs, and environmental restoration. These deals will be partly financed by auction returns from the sale of emissions rights. It makes so much sense. I just want to high-five Antonio Banderas just for being Spanish. Just transition, shutting down fossil fuel production and pollution, and investing in renewables. Yes! These logical moves once again prove what's possible when engaged citizens demand change based on scientific evidence. It proves what governments can be moved to do and accomplish if they acknowledge the will of the people and reality. These shifts won't be simple, and the plan still has to pass Parliament, but this move already serves as an inspiration and leading example to the rest of the industrialized world. I'd go so far as to say that there's really no reason why we couldn't institute something like this here in the States. But this coming weekend, a significant barrier to legislation like this will be signed. The USMCA, or NAFTA 2.0, is just that, a renegotiation of the devastating NAFTA that decimated jobs, wages, livelihoods, and more in the US as well as in Mexico. With regards to climate, and indeed every aspect of our lives, from healthcare to food, USMCA is but a flimsy new slogan on an old, rotten trade deal that once again places profit over people and planet. For more, Margaret Flowers of Popular Resistance and Trade for People and Planet has the details. Take a look.
Well, one industry that really wins out in the new NAFTA is the fossil fuel industries. So basically, if the United States wants to transport gas or oil to Mexico, we can't use it. It's automatically granted. It's like there's no barriers. There's no way that we could stop it. The fossil fuel industry also has, there's certain industries that aren't going to be allowed to use the investor-state dispute settlement, which is, for your listeners, basically where corporations can sue governments if they pass laws that interfere with their business or their profit. And so while other industries are not going to be able to use that anymore, the fossil fuel industry gets to use it. So also there's no kind of environmental enforcement. So if a polluting industry wants to move into Mexico, from the U.S., because we won't let them pollute here, they can go pollute there. So that's a big winner for that industry, which is very sad these days, given climate change and all that.
And there's also no mention of climate change in the entire agreement.
Yes, just like the TransPacific Partnership. It's the new trend. I don't know of a trade agreement that ever mention climate change. Agriculture, big ag is going to win out big on this. Well, one is basically the food inspection is going to be very lax, and corporations have a lot of flexibility to not have their foods inspected when they pass across the border. Country of origin labeling is not going to apply in the new NAFTA. Companies like Monsanto, there's a lot of ability for GMOs to be used and things like that. Pharmaceutical industries are going to win out really big because of the patent protections and the ability for them to, if they patent a drug, and usually those patents are for a limited time, but under this, they can do what's called evergreening, where if they come up with a new method of delivery or a new indication, like you take this for headaches, but now we understand it also works for earaches, so we're going to renew the patent. Right. And so that really prevents generics, and there are other barriers to generics as well. And so the cost of medicines are going to, be able to stay very high under this.
So does the ISDS apply to the pharmaceutical industry in this?
So right now, the only industry that's that is it's a certain time period. It's
Right.
like in Mexico, after 3 years, ISDS goes away for all but the fossil fuel industry. But there's this big kind of gaping, and other sectors of industry also can be included. So we don't really know what that means.
It's vague.
Yeah, it's vague, and usually when they make it vague, it's because they have that big loophole that they can slip the other corporations in there. But what's interesting now is that things are changing, and I'm not sure if corporations even need ISDS anymore. There was a case where a Canadian mining company, Venezuela, kicked them out of the country. They sued Venezuela in a U.S. court for the losses they incurred as a result of that. And
Outside
the U.S.
of ISDS?
Right. This was just a regular court. And the U.S. court ruled that they could give whatever assets Venezuela had through Citgo in the United States to the Canadian company to pay them back.
Wow.
So, yeah, that's a whole new area, I think, where I imagine that we'll see more of that.
Which is interesting because ISDS, that particular point that ISDS won't apply to everyone after an amount of time is one of the things that several organizations have come out and said, oh, well, this will give us the chance to make NAFTA better,
Right.
As opposed to saying, oh, no, this is still a terrible deal. Talk about that particular issue that some organizations are seeing that as this sort of like carrot as to think that, oh, we can actually make this better.
Right. I mean, one thing that past trade agreements were able to get through because certain sectors of society, environmental groups, labor, whatever, would give them cover, would say, oh, well, we got this in the deal.
Right.
So, and that confuses people, right? Because now they're seeing this organization saying that they support it. That started to happen during the TransPacific Partnership fight, and we were able to push back and say no, even if there was that little bit of good. Like labor was saying, well, if you put in these certain labor standards, then we would support it. But what good are labor standards if there's no mechanism to enforce them? So there was one particular organization, Public Citizen, that worked very hard with the U.S. Trade Representative Office to try to improve the language around ISDS. And I think that they are, they feel like they got something there. But we still look at the whole agreement and say, no, this is bad overall. Even with that, it's still not going to fix what we want. Plus, we really have to send a message to the lawmakers, whoever they may be, that we're not going to tolerate this model of trade anymore. That it's been proven over and over now for almost 30 years that this is bad for people on the planet, and we need a new trade model that actually raises up standards, has enforcement mechanisms, and we could do a lot of good through a trade agreement if we had like strong regulations on climate change or strong regulations on worker protections. We could actually halt the race to the bottom in wages and working conditions and start to lift it up for everyone.
And I want to talk about, because one of the things that you work on also is the Medicare for All fight. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious, how would something like this affect that ability to move forward if pharmaceuticals have these laws protecting them?
This is a big concern. I mean, this was a concern under the Trans-Pacific Partnership because countries that were involved in the TPP were ones that had some of the best healthcare systems in the world, so Australia, Japan, and part of the way that they keep their healthcare costs low is by being able to negotiate with the pharmaceuticals and set the prices. And what the Trans-Pacific Partnership basically said was, well, if you're going to negotiate prices, you have to also include our marketing cost, which for pharmaceuticals is like one of the biggest chunks. It's much bigger than research and development. And so that would automatically lift those prices up, and also just giving them more power to negotiate in those situations. And the fact that you can't do generics. And so this places a big burden on the cost of the healthcare system. And that could be a problem in the United States as well if we get Medicare for All.
So talk about, because I've been mentioning NAFTA, new NAFTA 2.0, but it's really going by the name, the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement.
Right.
Talk about this rebranding. Is it similar to like Monsanto now being a part of Bayer?
Right, absolutely. Yeah. NAFTA has a terrible reputation. People know that it caused, hundreds of thousands of jobs to leave the United States, that it decimated the Mexican economy, particularly the agricultural sector, and drove people off of their farms and into the cities, and drove migration into the United States as people were desperate. And so yeah, of course, this is like typical, right? So we don't want to say NAFTA. So, right. But U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement sounds really great. Like we're all friends, and
we agreed on something. Yeah. That sounds
and
cool.
if people don't know that that's actually the new name for NAFTA, then they won't have those bad, associations with it.
And talk about where we're at right now, because it seems like this is happening now for a reason, because Mexico has an incoming leftist president, which it doesn't sound like he would be pro this agreement. So where are we at right now in terms of the specific timing of this?
Yeah, so people probably know that the current president, Peña Nieto, is a right-wing neoliberal, and so this agreement was negotiated under his administration. So the last day that Peña Nieto is going to be in power is November 30th, and that's the day that the agreement is going to be signed in Argentina by all three presidents. Trudeau will be there as well. And it's interesting because López Obrador, the new incoming president of Mexico, has all these plans, apparently, and we'll see, if he's actually realizes them. Are these just campaign promises? But he wants to do a lot to improve food security in Mexico for people. And that's an area that could be seen as a threat to corporate profits. Absolutely. And corporations could sue Mexico over wanting to actually feed their people. So. Yeah,
because NAFTA completely decimated the campesinos and the ability for folks to make a living off of the land in Mexico. So that's... Yeah, that would be a huge threat.
And the people that write these agreements are really, to be honest, ruthless. I was able to overhear a conversation back during the TransPacific Partnership days. It was staff members of the Ways and Means Committee, USTR, U.S. Trade Representative staff, and industry staff. And they were talking about the Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership and the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And one of the things they were almost gloating about is that they got a provision into the TPP where countries are required, if there's a deal for them to export a certain amount of food, that within the TPP it said that if you don't, even if you have starvation and drought going on in your country, you are still required to meet your quotas for exports. So you can't say, I'm sorry, we need to actually keep that food here, our people are dying. You still have to export that. And they thought that was great that they won that. And that just gives you a sense of, where their priorities are.
Of who these people are who are writing this.
Yeah, there was other stuff they said that was just absolutely crazy as well.
And so you mentioned TPP. Talk about how this, because I feel like one of the big wins that Popular Resistance and Trade for People and Planet really had a big role in was stopping TPP. That was a big win. And so I feel like that might still be fresh in people's minds with regards to, wow, this is such an enormous global trade deal that really so pointedly puts profit over people and planet. Talk about the similarities between TPP and the new NAFTA so that people can kind of make that connection in their minds.
Yeah, well, some of the language from the TPP was put into the new NAFTA. So the language around pharmaceutical patents, around ISDS, around regulations. There's this... I think they call it regulatory coherence. And basically it means that if a government is getting ready to make some new laws that might impact the profits of corporations, they have to allow those corporations to know ahead of time as they're writing the law, which gives them an opportunity to then lobby the lawmakers and make sure that that language is written to their favor. So it gives them an advantage that civil society doesn't get to have.
And like we saw around TPP, the issue of fast track, that maybe you could talk a little bit more about that, but what does that mean for this deal as well?
Right, so fast track was passed under President Obama and it still is in effect, and basically the technical name for it is Trade Promotion Authority, but most people refer to it as fast track because it basically means that the administration goes out, signs the agreement. They are required to provide to Congress a listing of how it will impact the various laws, and then they send it to Congress to ratify the agreement, and they basically have 90 days to do the whole thing. So reading a very complex trade agreement and understanding it, they are limited to about 20 hours of debate. They aren't allowed to change it in any way, and then they're required to vote on it within a certain timeline. So this is a very anti-democratic process. Once it hits that, it's hard to stop, because in the past, a lot of the agreements have gotten through with just 1 or 2 votes.
Right.
And there's a lot of arm twisting that goes on. So we really need to, and hopefully people do have that memory of the Trans-Pacific Partnership and are ready to mobilize again, because we've got to very quickly make people aware of this and have them make their members of Congress aware that they're opposed to this, and hopefully make it so politically unpalatable that they don't even want to submit it to Congress because they know that they're going to lose.
And one of those points there that would make this incredibly powerful for people is to, like we talked about earlier, this is really every walk of life. You know, it's labor rights, it's healthcare, it's food sovereignty, it's climate change. So it's so many of people's primary issues that they're working on, all rolled into one, that would greatly affect their ability to do their organizing work. So.
Yeah. I mean, just think about polluting industries and fossil fuel industries. If they want to come into your community because they're gonna, extract gas or oil or build a pipeline to send it to Mexico, you have no recourse. Yeah. It's an automatic, it's automatically permitted.
Yeah.
So. People do need to feel that this is personal, and I think they did with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, understood how it undermines our rights to even protect our own communities.
Trade for People and Planet are organizing mass actions this weekend to draw attention to the signing of the USMCA and to get to work rekindling the opposition that crushed the TPP 2 years ago. To learn more about USMCA and to get involved this weekend and beyond, visit tradeforpeopleandplanet.org. And that will do it for this week's Dose of Dissent. Thank you so much for watching. Please do spread and share this with all of your friends, foes, and people that you don't know. Again, as always, do check out that last slide and the show description online in order to find sites that I've mentioned in this week's show. For interim updates, this is very important. Make sure that you sign up for our newsletter at the address below. That's the best way to stay in touch. To those who have donated, thank you so much. Please do keep spreading the word in order to ensure our ability to keep acting out. From the Devil's Den, good night and act out. And real quick, to keep independent, non-corporatized media like this show going, visit patreon.com/actout.
I can hear the boots are stomping. Come on, boys, let's get some rocks to throw. I can't stand to hear my father cry anymore. Time we left one of you motherfuckers dead in the road. We've been begging up inch by inch, we got nowhere else to go. It's been too many years since your push to serve my show.